So if Jason Garber from DNRC would like to come up, and the other folks who volunteered to sit with him are Sharon and Becky Clements and Julie Ralston and Haley Graff online. So all things 310. Talk into the microphone.
So thanks, everybody. Haley Graff is with us as well online as part of this panel. All of these folks are very experienced with 310, and I talk with everyone on this panel at least once a week regarding 310 subject matter. We got Tenley here too back there. She's an experienced hand in this field. So basically what I thought we would do here is I'm just going to go through a really quick and dirty 310's basic presentation, because there's folks here that are so new that 310 might be kind of a foreign concept. And it's interesting that Liz went to CSU. I'm a Wyoming Cowboy. They're our main rival, the border war. Yeah, yep, that's right. So yeah, I know. We're so close to Wyoming. I thought there'd be more pokes in here, but there's not. And so what I'll do is go through this presentation and then just save your questions for the end, because I think the value here is keeping it conversational and you folks asking questions of myself and especially the panel. And then the panel can kind of speak to their experience with different things like handling violations, declaratory ruling things, and realtor workshops and the like. So I think that's kind of how we'll present this. Kay's going to switch the slides for me as we go along here. This presentation is one that I've done before. We did it as part of our training module program at DNRC, so it'll go by pretty quick. So next slide. Brief history of the law. Really, this came about in the early 60s. The original intent was to have Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks run the program, especially for road type projects, infrastructure type projects. But in 1973, there was a legislative compromise whereby the CDs took control of implementing the 310 program. And this is a pretty unique thing in the country. I don't know of any other conservation districts that actually have a stream permitting program. And 2 weeks ago, Mary Hendricks, my colleague, and Mark Bostrom, our division administrator, were at the NASCA conference in Spokane. There were like 37 states represented there, I think. None of them had a program like this that they help CDs administer. So it's a very unique thing that we do here in Montana. Next slide. Yeah, so all 58 CDs participate in this program, and it's really geared for projects that impact the bed and banks of streams here in this state. Next slide. Just a brief graphic on numbers. So the CDs every year process between 1,200 and 1,500-ish applications or actions. It can be more or less than that. It's typically tied to things like flooding and stuff like that. There's one of the things I'm going to do this winter is kind of synthesize data from 2017 to present and kind of represent that graphically to see how those trends have changed over time. You know, did COVID have a big impact on numbers? I don't know that it really did. The 2008 recession certainly did. The 2011 flooding event in a big chunk of the state really had a big impact on numbers issued. Next slide. When I first got this job, I've been here about a little over 2 years. Lori Zeller did a really good job of kind of training me to think about how the process works. And there's really 4 key concepts here that you look at when you're doing permitting, and that's, first thing is determining your jurisdiction. Is the project reasonable? That reasonable language comes right out of the statute. Determining the purpose of the process or the project, and then making decisions based on the law and then the rules that each CD adopts. Next slide. And so speaking to, laws and rules, the Natural Streambed and Land Preservation Act is the statute that created the 310 law. And then there's administrative rules of Montana that DNRC developed. Those are the model rules. And then CDs adopt those rules. Next slide. The rules are there to help CDs through the process, through the permitting process. One thing I always say about the rules that each CD has is that for regulatory rules, they're actually pretty detailed, and they do a pretty good job of like walking you through the step-by-step process of how permits get issued. When I worked at DEQ, the program that I administered, the rules were pretty sparse, and there was a lot of policy concepts that kind of filled the gap there. There's the base model rules that CDs adopt, but a conservation district can go above and beyond that if they like. Flathead CD has construction specs for things like docks and boat ramps and stuff like that they've adopted. So if your board ever has interest in changing your rules, let me know and I can walk you through that process. Next slide. Occasionally, there's a need to modify your rules based on something that happened in the legislature. So this happened in 2019. It was a minor change. An applicant has 30 days to appeal a 310 permit versus it was 15 days in the past. Many of you in here have updated your rules to reflect that. I would ask when you get back, to the office to take a look at your rules and see if that 2019 update was done. And if it hasn't, contact me and I can walk you through that process. It's not that hard. This change was not controversial. It was kind of a procedural thing. But it's good to have your rules match what the latest legislative mandates are. That's just good housekeeping. Next slide. Definition of a project. So in 310 parlance, a project means an activity that the CD has jurisdiction over. And so that's geared towards natural perennial flowing streams. There can be some nuance to that. There could be projects that are on intermittent or ephemeral streams that will affect a perennial stream. And in those cases, a board can take jurisdiction of that activity. Next slide. So determining jurisdiction, this is something that's a little bit sticky. We work on this a lot in workshops that we do in the field because it's not really clear cut all the time. So there's basically three things you would look at there. Is it a perennial stream? Could that project affect a perennial stream? And if it does, then it's jurisdictional. It's not always that clear though sometimes. And I'll say that we do have, DNRC has technical assistance funds that are available for CDs. If you need to hire a consultant to help you determine if you have jurisdiction or not, we can help you financially get that done. Next slide. How do you determine jurisdiction? Some of this stuff is kind of antiquated. I mean, they used to use USGS quads. I threw a link in there. Radley Watkins pointed out this national map viewer that USGS has. That's a really handy tool. You can look at NHD, National Hydrologic Data Set flow lines. You can pull in aerial imagery. You can pull in all this really cool data to help you, at your desk, figure out if it's perennial or not. DNRC also has water resource surveys. There's more channel migration zone mapping being done all the time in the state. That can be handy as well. Soil and vegetation types, and then things like Google Earth. But another thing that's pretty handy too is to talk to folks. If you have a landowner that's had a parcel of land for a period of time, they can usually tell you if that stream's been flowing the last 40 years. Maybe there was a wildfire up there and there's not water in there anymore. And they can kind of like clue you into what's going on at that site because they live there, they walk by it every day. Next slide. The forms here, there's specific forms that are, so the joint application, which you all are familiar with, Form 270, there's about 7 agencies in Montana that use that format of form. I don't know how long that's been around. I think it's been around for like 20 years. You know, Tenley? It's been about 15 or 20 years that form's been around. And that came about because in Montana, even though we're kind of a sparsely populated state, there are sometimes up to 7 authorizations you may need if you're doing work on especially a big river in the state. And so it's kind of a pragmatic move to have a joint application that each agency can accept, developed, so that makes it a little easier on the regulated public. The rest of those forms there, you're all pretty familiar with those, I think, but those are specific to conservation districts. There's base forms we have on our website for all of these. You can modify them, you can format them however you want, as long as it has that base information on there. Next slide. Just brief 310 process. This is kind of a generic process out of the law. There can be nuance here, but basically it's a 60-day time frame from when an application is received and deemed complete. One thing I didn't mention earlier is that the Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks is an important partner in this whole thing. They're part of the team that inspects projects, and they advise boards. They don't make decisions, sole decisions on permits. They have their own permitting program for state and federal projects, but they advise the board, and they're a really important partner here in Montana. So this is just a basic kind of timeline of how long it takes to get a permit issued. Next slide. So when I get calls from the public, which I get a lot of public calls, and I'll say that too, you know, I get calls from the public all the time because I work for a state agency for DNRC, and so they don't know a lot of times which CD they're supposed to apply to. I get them your contact information and go from there. But I generally tell people it's going to be at least 60 days. It could be shorter than that, depending on when meetings are scheduled. But that's usually what I go with. And so that last example there is just a generic timeline of how long that process takes. We'll talk about this in the conversation we have after I'm done with this, but you know, there are times when applicants disagree with a board's decision, and they have the right to appeal a board's decision. They can also challenge the jurisdiction of a CD for a project on their property. This is the declaratory ruling process is a pretty interesting process that where that all plays out. I've had the opportunity, Becky's had the opportunity to experience this firsthand. It's a very detailed process. As far as my job, I would say that it's the most complex thing I deal with. You know, a lot of times the DNRC person in my position is appointed by the board as a hearings officer for this process. There are exhibits that both sides submit to the CD. There's a public hearing, which I had to run, which was pretty interesting. And then I review all of those exhibits, the hearing testimony, and then I work with the legal counsel for CDs and come up with a decision that then the board can either agree with or not. They don't have to agree with that. And then that's the decision. So we got to see this play out in Gallatin. It was kind of fun in a way. It was learning something new. I guess I'll put it that way. And we'll talk about that here in a bit. Also, an applicant can appeal a board's decision on an application. This doesn't happen very often. I would say statewide, maybe once a year, somebody wants to appeal a board decision. That doesn't happen very often because, you know, boards work pretty well with applicants to come to a solution that everybody can agree on. I think that's one of the great things about the 310 process. It's not super rigid like the Army Corps of Engineers or DEQ. So that doesn't happen very often, but occasionally, you know, it can't be resolved and it goes to court. Next slide. So we'll talk about this a lot in our discussion after this, but complaints, violations, and penalties are becoming a bigger issue in the state. There's just more people moving here, and that's what's driving a lot of this. And I'll say too that they tend to be folks that are coming from, you know, really populated parts of the country, and they move to Montana. And even though, you know, in Becky's home territory or Julie's, you know, to some of us, you'd be like, well, there's a lot of people here. But if you're from California, you know, it's the wilderness to them, and it strikes them as odd that they may need to get permits for a project. And so a lot of the complaint stuff that's coming in, especially in Gallatin County, is kind of geared towards those folks moving to the area. But there's a process for complaints. And one thing I always say too is that complaint form, it's really incumbent upon the complainee to fill that out properly and in a detailed fashion and submit that to the board. We don't want, you know, board or staff like going on some wild goose chase with sparse information. It has to be detailed. They have to have some skin in the game, and you work through it that way. But basically that whole process of issuing a permit is started here by getting that complaint form in, and then that whole 310 permit process gets going. Most of the time when folks get a violation letter from the CD, they want to comply with it. And that's a good thing. It can be an opportunity to have a learning moment there. You know, a 310 permit is good insurance for them to have. They've already collaborated with an agency. And it is just, well, what I was going to say there is it's better to work with folks and try to come to a solution than going straight to the punitive, you know, fine mechanism. That's there if it's needed. But I would say that 95% of the time, stuff gets worked out beforehand. Occasionally, you have somebody that gets bullheaded, and you come to loggerheads, and you can't settle it, and it goes to court. That doesn't happen very often, thankfully, but we do have DNRC pays for legal counsel, Caitlin Overland, to help the CDs through legal issues. And she's great to work with, by the way. I talk to her several times a week, and some of you do too. Next slide. So questions I get a lot: what if the complaint form is incomplete? I just say, you know, it has to be as complete as it can be. If somebody calls you and says, you know, and complains and gives you like a one sentence, hey, I don't like this, and hangs up, that's just not enough to go on. You need to have that complaint form filled out thoroughly. The anonymity thing has been a big deal that comes up a lot. As you guys know, most of it's a small state, small communities, folks want to remain anonymous. Caitlin her preference is that they include their name on the complaint form. And the reason for that is that if it goes to court, somebody can potentially be, they can testify or attest to what they saw. There are times where it may be appropriate to remain anonymous if there's threats of violence and things like that. But if somebody's getting that nasty with it, then law enforcement gets involved, and because they're getting harassed at that point. But that does happen. And you guys have all seen this. We've talked about situations where you can't go, I mean, you're a small community, so you can't go to your kid's 4-H event or a basketball game, and then you get cornered by somebody that had a complaint lodged against them. They want to know who submitted it, you know, that type of thing. But this comes up a lot. And like I say, the legal counsel would rather see folks put their name on that. Next slide. Emergencies is another big one. See lots of emergencies when there's flooding events, but then we see lots of emergencies when there's big drought events like we had this summer, right? And people can't get water into their intake structures. The one thing I point out in this slide is unforeseen up there, you know, so if it's a chronic issue where somebody's cabin board or something's been near that river for 10 years and they're not doing anything about it, I mean, they should just come in and get a permit, fix the problem, and move on. A lot of folks try to work into the emergency provision when it's not actually emergency. Next slide. These are just the notification procedures. The key thing there is that first bullet is that people need to get with the CD within 15 days after taking that action. And this is a lot like the complaint procedure. At that point, it just kind of starts the CD review procedure for a permit. Because the district may go out there and what they did was fine, but most of the time they need to fix what they did. And so that just starts the new 310 permit process at that point. Next slide. This flow chart, when I'm done here, I'm going to show you some web link stuff on our website, but this is the 310 emergency flow chart in graphical form. I'll show you where that lives on our website. It might be handy to have these printed out in your office. So when folks come in, you can hand them that, and they kind of know how this process plays out. A lot of times people just don't realize that in the heat of battle, right, if you're about to lose, life, property, you're not thinking about the permit you need. You're trying to save your property and stuff like that. And so it's good just to have it in the back of my mind, after the event's over, they need to get with the CD and start working through the permit process. Next slide. So these are just a couple of resources I want to point out. Kay, can you click on that, open that? This is just the stream permitting website, and this is mainly for the folks that are brand new. I was just going to point out where a couple of things live on there. We had the documents and webinars page minimized, I think, but I don't know if that one is on there. I can also, what I can do too is I can send out an email blast to the administrator listserv with these resources as well. A lot of you already know where they live, but I can show you that. But the other resource I was going to point out is there's a stream permitting book for Montana that goes through all the permits that are needed. Oh, there we go. So it's a stream permitting site. And if you scroll down there, the joint application lives there. And there's information on, so that's kind of that front cover of the little flip book thing. I have copies of those here. But it shows you the jurisdiction of different agencies in Montana. And then the other resource I was going to point out is the stream permitting binder. That was updated in 2020. If you're brand new staff or if you have like brand new supervisors, that's a good thing to just take out and flip through because it does a good job of walking you through not only the permits that occur in Montana, 310 included, but also design concepts of the projects that you're most likely to see day to day. And so I always point that out to new supervisors because they may not be that familiar with bank stabilization techniques or restoration techniques, culvert installation and the like. And all of those examples that are in that binder, all of those examples are ones that every agency has bought off on. So FWP, for example, likes to see culverts that are countersunk that have substrate in the bottom so that fish and bugs can move back and forth. So that's just a really good resource to have. And I can include that to that. Oh, you can stay right here for a second, though. So this, on our website, the CD resource documents page, at the top there, that top tab is the 310 subject matter, the forms and everything. There's other stuff below that that has to do with records retention, open meeting laws, and those resources as well beyond 310. So that's a good one to bookmark and have on hand. I refer to this page constantly for all kinds of stuff. So, so with that, that's kind of the end of my presentation part of this. But I'd like to have, Becky and Sharon and Julie and Haley kind of talk about their experience with stuff. And I guess first we can kick it off with complaints because, like I say, complaints are becoming a bigger thing now. There's more people moving to the state. There's more eyes on the landscape. You'll find that in the more populated areas, that's where you're going to see more complaints. There's just more people seeing stuff. If you're parts of eastern Montana where there's huge ranches, big tracts of one or two landowners, you're just less likely to get complaints because there's not as many people on the landscape. So I'll let Becky maybe, are you okay with kind of talking to that and kind of maybe your experience with it and just how you've seen that change over time? yes, we'll get it. I'll share it with you. It's already posted online. We did a 310 training module earlier this spring and we recorded it. So it's right up there for you. And it's the same exact presentation too. So.
So as Jason mentioned, we've been seeing a lot of complaints in Gallatin County. And as was mentioned during introductions, I've only been with the CD for 2.5 years, so I don't feel like I'm extremely knowledgeable, but we process a lot of 310s in Gallatin Valley, so I have that experience. I'm learning more every day. We're currently sitting at 90, over 90 310s, and that includes complaints for the year. 21 complaints so far for the year, and 3 more are coming for our next board meeting. What is becoming more common with us is people just calling to complain about things that are violations, but they don't have any information as to who the actual violator is. So I have to explain to people that we just need that piece of information. We can't do anything with it if we don't know who the violator is. One of the ones that Jason witnessed at our board meeting yesterday, in fact, started out as an incomplete complaint. Absolutely no information was provided. And I let the complainant know that I couldn't do anything with that. And then somebody else named who they thought was responsible for the violation. I talked to that person and come to find out, well, anyways, he denies that it was him. So we are working through that right now. I'm not quite sure how to proceed. And Jason witnessed that yesterday, kind of talking through that. We had multiple landowners that were there complaining about it. They wanted to share information and try to help, but at the end of the day, we just don't know who it is. Another complaint that I kind of want to highlight, is comical a little bit, was actually issued against our governor, Greg Gianforte. So, and it was funny because when the violation was submitted to me, it wasn't even a half an hour later, he also leaked it to the media. So lots and lots of media attention on that one. It turned out not to be a violation, actually, but the important piece to note in that is that just to be careful what you say, and recognize that, you know, there's a lot of media attention potential for this. So I focused a lot on trying to educate, explain the process to the media rather than really pointing out that it was about, you know, our governor and focusing on that fact. So, what else? Any? Oh, well.
One thing I was just going to add that you kind of reminded me of is is just good record keeping too. You know, so a lot of times when I am giving presentations and stuff, it's for supervisors or it's at a 310 workshop. But the staff are the folks that kind of manage the files in the office, and it's just really good to keep your files in good order and keep it consistent over time. And there's leeway there on how you can do that, whatever way makes sense to you. But if something goes to court, you'll be furnishing that information to, you know, legal counsel. And if it's really organized on the front end, that just makes that process a lot easier. I will tell you that, I mean, almost every single time the conservation wins those cases and stands on the high ground, the one kind of threat that's out there is they try to get you on like an Administrative Procedures Act violation. So you didn't follow your process, or you have information that's missing somewhere in that file. So like maybe you don't have very thorough meeting minute notes of what occurred at the meeting, because that's where the permit is being discussed and a decision's being made. So just keeping that stuff in good order is really important. And I think Becky handled that exactly how you should handle it. This media component here, it's like, forget about like the fact that it's the governor. It's like, no, here's this process and here's how this plays out, and that's a good way to put that fire out, and it's just the facts too. So that's really handy. Haley, do you have anything to add about violation component?
Well, first of all, can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. So, Jason, as you've alluded to before, my biggest recommendation is to go back to the statute and go back to your adopted rules over and over and over. Make sure you're following those processes. So this little handbook here, Jason, maybe you've got copies with you, I don't know.
Sure do.
But that is, that's your friend. And if you can refer to that, it will walk you through most circumstances. And then I'll just add on and throw in my 2 cents for the record keeping as well. It's hugely important. It'll get you out of a jam if your files are organized and you can document that you have followed your procedures. One thing I would add to what you said is that be careful what you put in emails. Because if you are communicating a lot via email about a 310, that can be called into court should you go to court. So just kind of be careful and make sure that your communication is taking place as it should be with a quorum.
Yeah, that's a great point, Haley. We have maybe at our DNRC table when we do the breakout, I have materials here that includes that brochure that Haley held up there. But what I do is I have the model rules in a binder on my desk like all the time. So when you guys call and ask me a question, like some of this stuff I know by reflex by memory, but I always go back and I open up the rules and make sure that if I give you an answer, it's straight out of those rules, And after a while, you kind of, I've worked in Clean Water Act compliance for 10 years, and I would know my rules, cover to cover, but I always go back and refer to that. It's just always right there in front of me. And I would suggest, doing that too. And it's just a good way to learn it. I really try to get supervisors to do that too. I really try to get them to do that. You should just have those around. Put them on your toilet tank at home, as Jeff Ryan would say. Just have it handy, because that's what gets you out of a jam, is following your process. If you follow your process, you've got the high ground every time. Yep. Yeah, and the question, if you guys couldn't hear that, what Radley Watkins mentioned is that if you're writing correspondence, you can cite the rules in that correspondence, and I think you should. That's what the letter is about. I think that's a good idea, Rad. I think, yeah, you can come up here and. We'll give Tinley the mic here.
Sorry. I was just going to say, we jumped from complaints to violations, and, complaints, we're all getting a lot more complaints, whether they're factual or not, I think, because, well, one, we're in a drought, so someone's got to be taking the water, right? So, there's always that kind of stuff. But also, within your violations, just understand what your scope is, because we've gotten violation complaints, or there's violations, and it's a violation for another entity, right? Another agency. So just make sure that you're staying within the district's purview, or what exceeded our scope, your permit scope kind of thing, because again, Army Corps may have different rules that are violated that didn't violate ours, or floodplain for sure. Or, you know, we had one where the funders weren't happy because they didn't do, we need to stay within our scope. So I just wanted to make sure that.
That's correct, Tinley, and we tend to get off base a lot of times, but as long as I've been in this 22 years, it's always something new that comes up. Like the last couple of years, we've had this woody debris issue on the Bitterroot River, and tons of complaints filed against fishing guides, and no one knows who's doing the work, cutting things out of the way and stuff. And so it's always a challenge as a district, but if you stay within your rules and regulations, that's the safest place to be. And don't get caught up in the fight between two entities. Don't get caught up in that. And even like now, we have a evolving discourse that's being proposed in Darby, and so we're going to look at it on Tuesday. But so we're gonna, you know, they're looking to see if they have jurisdiction, and they have to stay within that jurisdiction. Is it going to physically alter the Better Banks of the stream, what they're proposing? And we are getting tons of calls. Well, Darby, the city of Darby doesn't even own that land. Who owns that land? You guys can't issue a permit because they don't even own the land. Well, you have to remind people you can issue a permit. It doesn't give them the right to go out and do something until they have all their other permits or landowner permission to do that. And so that's something you as a district, you can't get caught up in that either. So just a quick note.
Thanks. I have a question along the lines of issuing a permit when someone doesn't even own the land. I think the state rule doesn't specify that an owner has to sign a 310 permit. It does? Didn't we just?
No, it doesn't.
It doesn't.
It doesn't. The statute doesn't talk about signatures at all, actually.
So theoretically, anybody can apply for a 310 permit on any piece of land in Montana, which is a kind of crazy thing. You could do that to, if your neighbor was about to sell their property and you wanted to put kind of a smurge, you know, their property by having it denied for a 310. I think that's something that we might want to look at next time we go around and make sure that the owner is tied to the 310 permit. I think Missoula County might look at that on our rules, but I think that'd be a good one for the whole state before that becomes a problem. And I'd love to hear comments on it. The other quick question I had is this: has the state ever been, or the district ever been sued for not enforcing a 310 permit for a complaint? You know, if you don't follow through on a complaint and something gets violated, most regulatory agencies I know have been sued at one point for not doing their job. I'm pretty new. I'm not familiar with a district being sued, but I wonder about that. If that could happen, you know, something occurred and the district said, well, you know, it was an anonymous complaint, so we didn't follow through, and then the district, you know, ends up in court.
I'll just say real quick, I don't know of one like that. Maybe Julie does. I mean, when I worked at DEQ, we got sued all the time by NGOs for that exact scenario. The CDs, at least thus far, haven't been targeted in that way, I guess, you know, because they're kind of short-term type projects. It's not like a wastewater treatment plant or something like that. But maybe Julie knows more.
Actually, I believe that we were sued one time for a bridge crossing that went in, and we actually lost in court, and so they went ahead and put the bridge in, but we didn't have landowner permission on that one. And I'm just gonna say, if we start requiring that it's our responsibility to determine who the landowner is, that's gonna put a lot more liability on us. We usually throw that liability back on the applicant because it's their responsibility, because we're just looking at the Stream Bed Preservation Act. We're not looking at who the landowner is, what they're doing. We're looking at, are they going to physically alter the bed or banks of the stream? And if they are, that permit does not give that person the right to go ahead and do the project right now. But I'm worried if we went down that road that we would be in court a lot more.
Yeah, and I think one thing too is that there's plenty of other backstops that would stop that from happening. I mean, for one thing, then it would become a civil case between those two entities, and that has happened, where it's not the 310 that's being, or the Army Corps 404 permit or DEQ authorization that's being called into question. It's an issue between two landowners, for loss of property or something like that, and they sue each other that way. That's how it gets worked out, like every time. So, but I've never seen it play out like exactly like your scenario where somebody just randomly, or maybe not so random, but well, I got this permit, I'm going to take over your land. In Montana,
Hey,
that doesn't
Jason?
go over well. Yeah, go ahead, Haley.
Yeah, so I just wanted to share one example that we had where we issued a permit to an applicant, even though the landowner did not want that permit to go through. And that was because the applicant had mineral rights, and they had legal access to the property, and where they were going to be doing their mineral rights was basically in the stream bed. So we legally issued them a 310 permit. The landowner refused to sign, and he was angry that we issued the permit because he thought his refusal to sign the application would mean that he could block this person's mineral rights by not allowing them to get a 310 permit. So we had to communicate with Don McIntyre about that a little bit, but in the end, the permit went to the applicant and not the landowner.
So we're seeing that with out-of-state landowners too, and irrigators that have an easement to their head gate to get water through. The landowners believe they have the right to stop them from getting their irrigation water, and so they wouldn't sign an application form. And if the rule was, then they might be able to put that into court. And because we've had several new out-of-state landowners that have appealed the permit that we've issued for irrigators, but the irrigators have that access to the water, and that head gate's been there for like 40, 50 years, and they've had the right for that 100 years in some cases. So, yeah.
Yeah, another one just to piggyback on that is that if somebody's going to put in a diversion, it's not the district's job to make sure they have water rights for that. That's the Water Rights Bureau at DNRC that handles all that. So you don't even look at that component when you're issuing the 310 permit. So, and Tenley has her hand up. You should just join the group here, Tenley. You're as experienced as anybody, so.
I was just going to say, we have had people who lease like DNRC land and then have a project on a stream. We have requested a letter or something from the landowner, even though they have a lease on that land. Not always, but in certain circumstances where they're modifying that stream quite a bit or whatever, we've requested that. So.
I will say that we typically require a landowner signature too. But in cases like mineral rights or water rights, no. So it's nice to notify the landowner, though, so you don't have an angry phone call.
So on this theme of, demographics in Montana changing and more folks moving here, I had the opportunity to participate in a realtor workshop that Laverne Ivy with Yellowstone CD put on in May. And I think she worked with the Yellowstone County Realtors Association on that. And it was myself, it was the Army Corps of Engineers, somebody from DNRC State Lands, and the 2 local floodplain administrators were there. I get a lot, I don't know about you all, but I get a lot of calls from realtors, which is a good thing, inquiring about, a parcel they want to sell, or they're working with a buyer on a piece of land, and they know a project's been done there, and they want to know if a permit was ever issued for it. And so I put them on to the local conservation district and the Army Corps of Engineers and stuff. But at this workshop, it was great because it was really well attended. The room was full, and we kept it at a pretty high level, I guess. I talked about rule and statute a little bit, but we also just showed pictures of, like, here's what a restoration project looks like. Here's what a bank stabilization project looked like. Here's a bridge that was put in, just to kind of get it in the realtor's mind of what's going on there, so they can communicate that with their client. That was really well received. And there's been others of those that have been done, like in the northwestern part of the state, up around Thompson Reservoir. But that's kind of a handy tool in the toolbox too. So if you ever have interest in that, we can kind of put our heads together on how to set something like that up with a local realtor group, and discuss that stuff. And because I have to say, I'm really heartened that the realtors take the initiative to call myself and you guys and ask these types of questions. That's a really good thing to know on the front end, especially with a lot of folks moving to the state from different parts of the country. So yeah, that's something valuable too. And I think Sharon, we talked about that earlier today, about maybe doing something like that here. As you saw driving in here yesterday, or maybe not because it was foggy, but pretty beautiful place. Got the Beartooth in the background, a lot of water, desirable place to live. A lot of people want to live here. And so the realtors are kind of facilitating a lot of that stuff. Kind of like the housing market, a lot of stuff is being sold kind of sight unseen in a way. Can be some pretty wealthy landowner types. But if the realtors are kind of with us on this, at least just on the education end, that's really, really helpful. So are there any, ask us your questions. I'm sure there's questions out there. Oh, one other thing I want to plug, since I didn't see any hands up, was so Caitlin Overland is the contract attorney that we pay for that's at your service. So if you have legal questions, it doesn't even have to be 310 related, let us know and we can put you in contact with her. She's great to work with. She's super responsible, responsive. Of course she's responsible, she's an attorney. But she's great to work with, and she's a lot of fun to work with. Becky and I worked with her like a lot during this declaratory ruling process that was going on in Gallatin County. That's just a really great asset to have for conservation districts and for me and my colleagues at DNRC too. So the declaratory ruling process, since I mentioned that, Becky and I dealt with that. That was interesting. It was a controversial project, and it made the paper a lot. I kind of quit reading the Bozeman Chronicle because that always came up, and you'd read the article and I'm like, oh, that's not right. Becky, you want to talk about that a little bit and just kind of your thoughts on how that went down? And I think it's intimidating when the district gets sued and there's legal stuff and you worked on it. And I've been there at DEQ, we got litigated, and you feel like you did something wrong and it's attack on you. It's not at all. It's not. You're covered by the corporate shield. And so maybe Becky can kind of talk about that process in case you have to go through it.
So this particular project, actually it wasn't a project, it came across our desk. I think it started in October 2019 and it came across as a complaint. It has taken months to work through the kind of investigation and the inspections, and to get to where we are now, it's taken months. it's the Glamp Ground. I don't know if anybody's familiar with this in Gallatin County. A landowner wants to develop kind of an island area right along the Gallatin River into a Glamp Ground. And of course, the neighboring landowners oppose it and have kind of been the main push behind the complaint getting filed and opposing it through up until now. We gave the landowner the opportunity to submit a retroactive 310 permit to kind of show us what he had done. He had done some work digging out a pond and on a, he claims it's a ditch. We say it's a stream on his property. And so we allowed him the opportunity to submit a retroactive 310 to see if maybe, just see what he had done before we figured out how we were going to mitigate it. And he decided to instead ask for a declaratory ruling. He is disputing the CD's jurisdiction. We fielded hundreds of emails, and those all had to be part of the public record. Caitlin and Jason have been amazing. It was my first time going through anything like this, and like Jason said, it's very intimidating having lawyers call and just communicating with, this legal process. There's a certificate of record that needed to be filled out and maintained, and that was ultimately, it was turned into Jason for the declaratory ruling process. And since the landowner has further disputed our ruling in the declaratory ruling, it's now at the district court level. And so the record that I kept at our office has gone all the way up to the judge at the district court level, and that's where we're at now. Caitlin has been amazing. Any question I have had, she's been quick to respond. And she's basically represented our district through the whole process. It's been, it's a ruling against, or it's asking for a ruling against us, but Caitlin has been amazing in representing us. We, other than, keeping good records and following the processes, we really haven't had to worry about anything. Caitlin's been amazing. So she's a resource, absolutely.
So we've had 3 declaratory rulings in the 22 years I've been there. And documentation is the biggest issue. Just make sure you document everything. And in all of them, we always had to do like an exhibit, and it was just me to file every exhibit, every map, every note, every email, every letter, everything has to be documented and exhibited. And I have binders and boxes for like the Mitchell Slough, where we went to district court, we went to Supreme Court. We lost, but we didn't lose because they told us to go ahead and take jurisdiction on the Mitchell Slough, even though it was a ditch in many areas, and we had hydrologists and other people that said it was. But the court still ruled that we need to take jurisdiction on it, and so we did. But that's one case. Another case was on a stream that got altered through EQIP and RCS, where they used to go through and straighten streams and move them. And one disappeared, went underground, and the district said, well, we're not going to take jurisdiction from this point to this point because it doesn't flow. It ends and it disappears. Who knows where the stream went? It probably went into some kind of drain somewhere or something. And so we had to hold a declaratory ruling on that one, document, get help from Don McIntyre from DNRC is a great place to go, and they really helped us out on all 3 declaratory rulings. But just remember not to take it personal, and just make sure that you go ahead and you document everything, because that's what's gonna save you in court and yeah. So, go ahead.
So I started out with, Don McIntyre started with a process that we had. We had a violation come in, and it was anonymous because it was an NRCS employee. But then my supervisor stepped up and Fish and Game, and they took over and they filed their own complaint with putting their name, because our district doesn't care for anonymous. So I had my supervisors and Fish and Game step up and write their own so that we could move forward. We ended up almost going to court. Caitlin was great. I think ours was maybe the first one when she was hired on to help us through the process. So it was a learning curve for her and for us, because I had never gone through the process. About the part of taking it personally, I kind of did, because it actually ended up that the landowner was attacking me and pressed charges against me. It ended up getting dropped because he tried doing trespassing charges against me for taking pictures from a county road. 2 years later, he had the road abandoned and then tried charging me with trespassing. So it never ended up going anywhere. And the sheriff's department, I had to go turn myself in and all this stuff. So it was a nightmare. So the one thing I can say about it, and Caitlin was great, is that I had good documentation. I had calendars, I had checklists, I had pictures with dates on them. I didn't know that was going to go this far, but it was a very serious complaint. It ended up, they created a dam to, we still don't know why. They built a landing strip over the creek. So with that dam, it ended up breaking the dam, and it almost took out the interstate, Highway 90, and the railroad. So it was a pretty serious, so we ended up settling out of court a week before the jury trial on this, for him to just pay his fines. So, and we were pretty lenient on the fines, and we went through mitigation, and the board even went down and went to a lower amount, and he refused. So we ended up moving forward with Caitlin, and like I said, a week before we were supposed to go to court, he ends up saying, okay, I'll settle. And he settled for more than what we mitigated. So it's like, okay, whatever. So yes, that was our story that we just got in dealing with. It was a 3-year process, and I'm glad it's over. And the learning experience was documentation, and to, keep everything so you know what's going on, know the law, and, we used Fish and Game as a great resource. We work closely with them, and Army Corps of Engineers. So yeah, that's it.
Hey, Jason.
Yeah, go for it, Haley. This is I think we have like 3 minutes left, so maybe your closing thoughts on this.
Okay. Well, I'll just say one more tip that I've started using for 310s, regardless of the situation, is we have daily time trackers that we fill out like a time card. I'm not sure what other systems other people use, but we use them to keep a record of important 310 actions that we take. And I end up referencing that a lot more than I originally thought I would. So I will put in my daily time tracker, even if it only took me 5 minutes, I might say left voicemail with landowner regarding violation, whatever. So that if at a later date, somebody calls into question of like, oh, you never told me that, I can say, no, I have it here on record on this date at this time, I told you that. So that's just one way that we keep track of our actions to reference later, and that's proved to be pretty valuable.
Can you mention your checklists that you use too, Haley?
Yeah, sure. So we also developed, and I'm going to use the royal we here because Ginger Kaufman developed these before I was actually an employee here. But we have sort of procedural checklists that we use for different types of 310 processes. So we have one for complaints, one for violation, one for a standard application, and one for an emergency. And on the checklist, it goes in the front folder of our file. And we go through and we check off when each step was done, and we initial who did it and write the date down of when it was done. And then it's highlighted different things as to whose responsibility that is. So things that are the responsibility of the board that staff do not have the authority to make that decision, we highlight so we know to make sure that those are done by the board during a meeting. So that would be an example of, the board votes, yes, it is a violation, and here's what you have to do about it. We would check that off, say it was done during a meeting, and then the next step might be, prepare the meeting minutes. And then when those are done and the letter is sent out to the landowner, we check that off and initial it and date it. So those check sheets are what keeps us organized, because we've got so many 310s at any given time that if we, if somebody were to call and say, hey, did you send the letter to the landowner on an application? It's too much to keep in your brain. So if anybody wants copies of those check sheets to take a look at them, I'd be happy to email them out or drop them in the chat.
Please drop those in the chat if you don't mind, Haley. Thanks.
Okay, give me a few minutes and I'll do that.
Well, yeah, we can send them out via email too. Alrighty, well, we're at 10:30 on the dot. Anything else? Anybody? All of us will be here. You can ask questions of us. I'll be at the DNRC table for the roundtable portion. So if you think of something that you couldn't think of in the last hour, let me know. Y'all have my contact information. Never hesitate to call me and ask questions. I enjoy working with everybody, and it's a chance for me to learn something new too. So don't hesitate to call with those questions. And if you need legal help, you've got that too. So, Heidi. Correct. So the question is, do we have funding to help with technical reviews for jurisdictional calls? Yes, we do. There's a process for that. I usually it's a task order that I do. It's not that hard, but if you think you're going to need that kind of help, let me know and we'll work together on that process. Okie dokie. Well, thanks for having us, everyone. It's been a pleasure.